Blog Talk Radio.
Paranormal Review Radio.
Hello and welcome, everyone. It is Friday night, and you are listening to Paranormal Review Radio with your host, Anthony Gotti from New York, but actually, I'm in Los Angeles tonight.
And I'm Lucy Liebfried from Chicago. Are you ready for another Paranormal Friday night? We're so happy that you can join us tonight. We welcome all our regular listeners and those of you who have tuned in for the very first time. If you have a question for our guest or about the topic tonight, feel free to ask us in the chat room or call into the show at 661-244-9831. We'll try to get to you as soon as we can. Don't forget that you can always send us an email with future topics that you'd like to see on the show, or if you just want to say hi. Our email address is paranormalreviewradio@yahoo.com. And last but not least, check us out on our Facebook show page and on our YouTube channel for more information on the paranormal and upcoming shows.
I actually just want to make sure that my phone is properly working because I'm working off of my cell phone in the hotel room right now. So if you guys in chat, if you're able to hear me okay, just type in there that everything is all right and you hear me well enough before I go on. Okay, as we all are aware, mainstream science has not accepted paranormal claims as true, explainable, and logical science. Our guest tonight feels that the scientific community should not so easily dismiss paranormal instances and that there exist mathematical and logical equations that should keep everyone at least open-minded enough to at least keep the discussions on the table. The book, The Paranormal Equation, A New Scientific Perspective on Remote Viewing, Clairvoyance, and Other Inexplicable Phenomena, is wonderfully written by Mr. Jim Stein. Jim Stein received his BA from Yale and his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. He is a professor of mathematics at California State University in Long Beach, California. He has served as a consultant to educational and textbook review committees for Texas and California, and has worked on projects involving mathematics education for both the state of California and the National Science Foundation. His background includes working on projects related to the moon landing in the 1960s and as a stock options trader during the 1980s. His books focus on what mathematics has been able to tell us about the universe we live in and how that knowledge can be used to improve our lives. Unfortunately, he has yet to find a way to use mathematics to improve his ability to play either tennis, to the relief of his opponents, or piano, to the despair of his neighbors. Let's explore how mathematics and logic can possibly help explain the paranormal. Please help me in welcoming Mr. James D. Stein to the show. Hi, Jim. Welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm very good, and thank both you and Lucy for inviting me on your show. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Welcome to the show, Jim. You know, I find it fascinating whenever someone in the academic and science world comes forward with a possible alternative to what mainstream science is regarded as beyond reason. How were you able to cross the line from mathematics into the paranormal?
I don't think it's that much of a line drawn in the sand that mainstream science refuses to cross, because there have been a number of instances in which very respectable scientists, both past and present, are willing to investigate it. It's just that the standard for proof for anything scientific, and for mathematics in particular, is extremely high. In order for something to become part of what we normally think of as mainstream science, there's a very high bar that is set. And even though there are scientists today who believe that bar has been exceeded by various demonstrations of paranormal phenomena, the scientific community as a whole doesn't feel so. And so I think that to characterize mainstream science as dead set against paranormal phenomena is sort of a little unfair to mainstream science. It does say, as yet it hasn't been proved, and there's a very large problem because in order to prove things about the paranormal, one has to rely on a good deal of evidence that's anecdotal in nature, because there hasn't been an experiment along the lines of Galileo going up to the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa and dropping a pound of iron and a pound of feathers and seeing that they fall at the same time. There's no such experiment like that I know of that paranormal phenomena have been able to establish. And indeed, even though the evidence is considered by some scientists to be more than significant, it tends to be more on the nature of we have a lot of different results here, and where there's smoke, there's fire, rather than an absolute smoking gun that you can hang your hat on and say, yeah, we got it.
Mm-hmm. Well, have you yourself ever experienced paranormal phenomena?
Not even close. Actually, I'm wondering whether or not that's probably a little unfair, because I've experienced things like I think many other people have that would be considered to some extent paranormal. I've awakened in the middle of the night with a feeling that, something has happened to a loved one that I was worried about. And so I've done what many people do in this instance. I've placed a phone call or tried to get in touch with that. And in every single instance, and there haven't been that many of them, everything's been fine. But I have experienced what one would call, an intuitive feeling that something's wrong, or that something exceptional has happened. On the other hand, many of my friends claim to have had paranormal experiences of one form or another. And when I say they claim to, these are people whose judgment and whose probity I trust substantially. I think they have had what they consider to be paranormal experiences. It's just that maybe I'm too, maybe it just hasn't happened to me. But when somebody that I trust says that something has happened that is at present not something that I would consider explicable, one of two things are at work. Either the person is wrong, and I don't believe that. I think that they've really experienced what they think that they've experienced. However, I'm not sure that paranormal phenomena are exactly what they are described as, namely beyond the reach of science to explain. It's possible for science to explain something by saying this is beyond the reach of science to explain. Because that happened in mathematics. That was one of the things that I mentioned in my book that actually led me to write this particular book, is that we tend to think of science as, it does things like Galileo proving that things drop at the same rate. And, of course, there are so many scientific experiments that have been performed that enable us to live much more comfortably in the modern world. We have the germ theory of medicine, which enables us to treat diseases. We have the quantum theory, which enables us to build all these wonderful electronic gadgets. But we haven't come up with experiments that absolutely tell us that paranormal phenomena either could or could not be a reality. But what we have come up with in mathematics is we have come up with the fact that mathematics has proved something that is rather difficult to credit when you first hear it. Mathematics has discovered that there are mathematical truths that mathematics itself cannot substantiate. And that was one of the great discoveries of 20th century mathematics, possibly even the greatest, because prior to that, and the person who discovered this was an Austrian logician named Kurt Gödel, people thought that all the results in mathematics were either provable or disprovable. And in order to prove things in mathematics, you can't just go around and just examine a few isolated instances. You have to use logic. I'm going to refer to something that is in mathematics, but it isn't necessary for anybody to remember the specifics. There's a theorem in mathematics, perhaps the best theorem in mathematics that was ever proved. It was proved 2,500 years ago by Pythagoras, and it's a theorem about right triangles. And Pythagoras couldn't go around and measure every single right triangle. That's obviously ridiculous because there are an infinite number of right triangles. What Pythagoras did was he used logic. There are axioms that define geometry as Pythagoras knew it, and he was able to use logic to prove that the relationship about the hypotenuse and the sides of the right triangle was a true one. And that's normally how mathematics goes about proving things. It uses logic and an axiomatic system. And it was felt prior to the 1930s when Kurt Gödel went to work that this would apply to every single possible mathematical statement. It was either true or false, but if it were true, a proof would exist. We may not be able to find it because, after all, some proofs are incredibly long. There are proofs in mathematics that are hundreds of pages, and there are probably propositions that are beyond our capability of proving simply because, we just don't have enough time as a species, just like there are scientific truths that we're never going to discover simply because we're a race that is limited in the amount of time that we're going to spend in the universe, and there just isn't time to discover everything. But what Gödel discovered is that there are truths which are beyond the reach of logic. And my contention is that there are scientific truths that are beyond the reach of science to actually prove simply by extension. It's sort of a parallel argument to what Gödel did, applying Gödel's results to things to which mathematics applies. I mean, when we think of what physics is, we think of things like Einstein's E equals mc squared, which is a relationship between energy and mass and the speed of light. And so we think of physics as relationships between measurable parameters. And what Gödel said is there are going to be relationships between numbers that you're never going to be able to establish. Well, if there are going to be relationships between numbers, there are also going to be relationships between measurable parameters that you will never be able to establish. And that opens the door for things to happen in the universe that science is never going to be able to establish. It's possible that paranormal phenomena lurk there. I don't know. I simply can't prove it, but on the other hand, there is a truly great scientist alive today, a guy by the name of Brian Josephson, who's won a Nobel Prize in physics for his investigations in quantum mechanics, and he believes that there's a connection between quantum mechanics and paranormal phenomena, and he's written papers on the subject. He hasn't convinced the majority of the physics community. Otherwise, you'd be seeing stuff about paranormal phenomena in your science textbooks. But when somebody really bright, somebody who's demonstrably brilliant, as Josephson is, believes this, and there have been numerous instances in past history where eminent scientists have expressed a belief in paranormal phenomena, you've at least got to take it seriously and keep it on the table. And I don't think science has even come close to disproving that paranormal phenomena can exist. And some of the things that have happened recently tend to give a lot more credibility to the possibility of paranormal phenomena. Are you familiar with the recent work that was done in Japan regarding the MRI studies of dreams?
No, I haven't heard that.
Okay, well, this was fascinating. I mean, this is the type of thing. I read science magazines, but every so often something happens that just looks like it's from, it's sort of from paranormal phenomena or science fiction. What the Japanese scientists did was the following. They got a bunch of volunteers and they said, what we'd like to do is we'd like to keep track of what you are dreaming about. And when we're going to wake you up in at various stages, you're going to tell us what you're dreaming about, and we're going to look at the MRI scans, the electroencephalographic scans of your brains. And what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to construct the equivalent of a Rosetta Stone. What we're going to do is we're going to see whether there's a correspondence between the electroencephalographs that we see and the various subjects that you are dreaming about. So what they did is they kept at this for I don't know how long, but long enough to get some idea that they would see patterns in the waves corresponding to various subjects in dreaming. So then what they had to do is, like any science, what you have to do is you have to make predictions and see whether or not you're right. And of course, they're not going to nail it 100%. But what they discovered was that they could look at the graphs that the electroencephalographs displayed, and they could predict with 60 to 70% accuracy what the subjects were dreaming about at the time. Now, I think this relates to a paranormal phenomenon, not necessarily just dreaming, the idea of telepathy. Because telepathy is something that we normally think of as paranormal phenomena. I think in my book I discuss a number of things that I think most people would stick the label of paranormal phenomena on, like ESP or telepathy or clairvoyance or stuff like that. But I think telepathy is definitely in there. And I've been a believer in telepathy ever since, I almost hate to admit this, I read a science fiction novel when I was about 10 or 11 years old called Slan, S-L-A-N, by A.E. Van Vogt, who was one of the great science fiction writers of the 1940s and 1950s. And this was about a young girl telepath in a state that hunted down telepaths as enemies of the state. And since it was written shortly after World War II, and I was pretty naive when I read the book, it's sort of an analogy for what was going on, or, a metaphor for what was going on in World War II. But it was a fascinating story. I fell in love with the heroine, as 10 and 11-year-old boys are wont to do when they read books like this. But the idea of telepathy struck me as fascinating. And if you think about what the experiments in Japan are revealing, they're revealing that as we think, we essentially create electrochemical circuits and patterns in our brain. And these create disturbances in an electromagnetic field. These disturbances can be picked up at the moment by MRI machines. I don't know whether or not we're ever going to be able to get to the point where humanity is sensitive enough to pick up this type of vibration without some sort of mechanical assistance. But nonetheless, it brings up the very real possibility of being able to read thoughts, at least with mechanical assistance. And it's not just this has been sort of a dream for a while. I'm pretty sure that the Department of Defense looked at the idea of doing something like this for reading the thoughts of soldiers in the field so that they could communicate what they were thinking at a particular moment without the necessity of doing it by radio. I don't think much came of that because I think the experiments were performed about 15 or 20 years ago, and the sensitivity of MRI machines has increased substantially. But this, if nothing else, goes to show that ideas such as telepathy really have to be kept on the table, because there's some sort of scientific proof that at least justifies it, further investigation.
Well, to go a little bit further along those lines, I heard you give a great quote in a previous interview, and I have to repeat it. Science isn't the last word. Science is just the latest word. Do you feel that the science community is now more willing to conduct more experiments, just like the one that you just mentioned in Japan? Are they willing to accept the idea and experiment a little bit further, or do you feel as though we're sort of stepping back, or the scientists are stepping back a little bit and being more hesitant now?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for repeating that quote, because if I ever get a quote written in a book, put in Bartlett's quotations, I hope it's that one, because it's something I fervently believe about science. But I don't think it's so much about being open or closed to the idea. What people often don't realize is that science isn't this vast monolithic structure. It's an activity pursued by human beings who have to pay the rent and put food on the table. And in general, there are two major institutions that will support scientific research. One is the government, and the other is private corporations. If you were to go back a long distance in science, maybe 200 or 300 years, science was generally an enterprise that was pursued by wealthy individuals with time on their hands. But now science is generally underwritten by the government or by private corporations. And both of those institutions want something to show for their investment. If they're the government, for instance, the government sinks tons of money into health care. And one of the reasons that it does is it's not just total beneficence on the part of the government. What they'd like to do is they'd like the institutions that they support with funding to discover something really great so that the people who have advocated this particular funding can go to the voters and say, look what we just got you, keep us in office. And corporations are pretty much the same way. They're more interested in developing products that they can sell or, services that they can sell, which will increase their own bottom line. And this is the reason that those two institutions sponsor scientific scientific research. What they want is they want a return for their dollar. And the plain and simple fact is that, first of all, suppose that we discover that telepathy or telepathy is a possibility. How do you turn it into something that's profitable? You can see, for instance, the government has some interest because of possible military applications. But for instance, what immediate use can you see for telepathy as compared with something like medical research? So the fact is that it's hard to find funding for it. And scientists are like everybody else. What they want to do is they want to work on projects that interest them, but they realize that those projects have to be underwritten. And so even though there are a number of scientists who are willing to go out and investigate these things, because people, science has its own establishment, and the establishment tends to be conservative, like all establishments are. And even though science is ready to accept great new discoveries when they're made, there sort of has to be unambiguous proof that these really are great discoveries. And there are a number of instances in the history of science where great discoveries have been made, and it's taken them a long time to become established as the great discoveries that they actually are. The same thing happens in art. There are great artists and great musicians who live lives of abject poverty because they're not recognized in their own time. The same thing has happened to science and scientific ideas. And if you look at the scientists who investigate these things and are serious about it, first of all, somebody like Brian Josephson. Brian Josephson has an established reputation. You can't take a Nobel Prize away from somebody, no matter what else he does. That's the pinnacle of a scientific career. If he wanted to investigate the properties of used chewing gum, everybody would say, Brian, you've done your part. Be happy. But he chooses to investigate something that he firmly believes in. He wouldn't investigate it if he didn't. Very few scientists will. They investigate things that they believe in. And because he's an established scientist, he has the freedom to do this without worrying about where his next meal is coming from. Most scientists are on the path to acceptance in the community. And the difficulty with working in this area is that results are hard to come by. There's a lot of fraud. There are barriers to overcome that wouldn't be there if instead you decided to investigate a possible cure for AIDS or something like that. And so most scientists, even if they're interested in something like this, they'll say, "Well, I'll look at it later after I've become established in my career." And one of the scientists that I've talked to who really believes in paranormal phenomena is a guy named Dean Radin. I don't know whether or not you're familiar with him, but he was an established scientist. He was a very successful established scientist and doing what might be considered to be orthodox science. And after he'd established himself in his career, he said, this is not really what I want to do. What I want to discover is whether or not I can prove something that I firmly believe, that human consciousness has an effect upon the physical parameters that define the universe. And so this is the project on which he's working. And I've talked to him. He's incredibly underfunded, but he's a happy camper because he's doing what he wants to do. And some people will make that choice. Nobody holds it against, as far as I know, nobody holds it against Dean Radin that he's decided to go in this direction, just like nobody holds it against Brian Josephson. But both Dean and Brian know that in order to for their results to become accepted by the scientific community, they have to be as unequivocal as the majority of results that are accepted by the scientific community. The theories of gravity that Newton originally propounded and that Einstein revised, there were definitive experiments that established these as legitimate science. When the germ theory was originally proposed, it was laughed at. But nonetheless, along comes Louis Pasteur, performs a series of experiments which establish the germ theory. You have to do something like that, in my opinion anyway, in order to convince the scientific community. And maybe we're just not bright enough at the moment to devise those experiments. Maybe those experiments don't exist. Maybe those experiments, maybe the idea of paranormal phenomena exists in, I don't know whether you would call it a never-never land, but the fact is that if the universe is infinite, this is one of the points that I made in my book, if the universe is infinite, the results that Gödel established should apply, and there should be scientific laws, maybe like E equals MC squared, only a lot more complicated, that are true, but we will never be able to establish. And I think paranormal phenomena could lie there. Do I think that do I believe that they lie there? I'm not sure, but they could be there.
Well, Brian Clegg recently gave a complimentary review of the book, and he also admitted that this book was not the easiest to read, but well worth a try. And Lord knows I gave it my all to try and understand the book. So, in layman's terms, what is the bottom line of the book?
That's a very good question. I think the bottom line of the book, you don't really need to know mathematics or science, although I felt I had to put that in. I didn't really do any mathematics or science in the book. There were one or two arguments, but I know that mathematics is a tough hill to climb for a lot of people. But I think the bottom line of the book is that if the universe is infinite, there are going to be phenomena that are part of the natural universe that we will never be able to explain. Not because we're not bright enough or not because there isn't enough time. They are simply destined to remain inexplicable because logic can only take you so far, and there is nothing that science can do to transcend that, to get past that. There are going to be things that we can't explain, and to a certain extent that flies to some in the face of orthodox science, because orthodox science sort of believes that given enough time, enough money, and enough brilliant experimenters, we'll find it. It's sort of like, like the Marine Corps motto, the difficult we do today, the impossible takes a little longer. Well, the fact is that there is stuff that is genuinely impossible. Not impossible because we're not bright enough, not impossible because we don't have enough time, not impossible because the primary tool of science, which is logic and the measurements that our senses can perform, cannot extend to these truths.
Yes, Jim, there was a PBS special that I saw not too long ago, and probably, obviously, it was a repeat, but it offered the idea, and please don't get offended by this question, that math is not real, that math is the abstract study of something abstract, something disembodied from the material world. It is the opposite of science, therefore it may possibly be, categorized as supernatural. What do you say when people conjure up the question that is math out there in the universe for us to discover, or is it created by our brain?
Oh, I think it's out there for us to discover because we're discovering truth. And I absolutely agree with you. Math is not real. What makes math interesting, and I'm passionately fond of mathematics for two reasons. Number one is it's so eminently practical. I can't think of any other good way to work out a system of exchange where I can go into a Starbucks and buy a latte and a biscotti. The only way that I know is they tell me what the biscotti costs, they tell me what the latte costs. You add them up, and I pay them what they ask for, plus a little tip. I can't, it's just wonderful that mathematics applies to so many things. But I taught math for elementary school teachers for many years, and it was a wonderful course to teach. And most of the people who took the course were apprehensive because they wanted to teach mathematics to children because they knew how important it was. But they were comfortable, they were uncomfortable with mathematics themselves, and they wanted to know, how am I going to be able to teach this if I don't really understand it all that well? And I would tell them two things. The first was a saying by Einstein, who said, don't worry about your problems with mathematics. It's much more difficult for me. That's number one. And number two is I've been studying mathematics. Well, I wouldn't say that I was studying it when I was 5 years old. I was sort of learning it. But I've been investigating it and fascinated by it for well over half a century. And if you ask me what 3 is, I couldn't tell you. I can tell you a lot of things about systems which use the number 3. I can tell you about 3 in relationship to other numbers, 3 as part of the number systems. But if you were to ask me for a really good definition of 3, I'm stumped. What I can do is I can say, here are 3 cookies. This is what we do with children. Here are 3 cookies, and we show them pictures of 3 cookies. Here are 3 oranges, and we show them pictures of 3 oranges. And you can pair up the cookies with the oranges on a one-to-one basis by drawing lines to connect them. And that property of what you might call 3-ness is what we think of as 3. But if you ask me what 3 is, I have no idea. I certainly know this. 3 does not exist anywhere in the universe. 3 cookies and 3 oranges do, and that's what makes math so incredibly useful. It applies to so much stuff. As a matter of fact, if you were to ask me, there's a lot of stuff that you can't really define, but that isn't real, but is tremendously useful. Are words real? No. Is liberty, justice, freedom real? No. But they're incredibly useful concepts. They're sort of like pornography. We know it when we see it. And we can use it as part of our lives. And that's the same with mathematics. I don't object to the fact that people say it isn't real, because I don't think it's real myself. But you don't have to be real to be useful. And mathematics is incredibly useful.
Okay. Well, you know what? You briefly mentioned telepathy. And from the list of paranormal experiences and topics like spirits, near-death, what would you say what areas of the paranormal do you feel might be on the verge of being logically accepted as true existence?
Well, you mentioned one of them, and one of them is near-death experiences. And I've never had a near-death experience that I know of, but I know people who have. I had a friend who flatlined in the hospital, and he described the classic near-death experience. And, the classic near-death experience where you see the light, and you feel tremendously peaceful. And there was recently a very successful book written, I think it was called Proof of Heaven, describing how an Orthodox medical researcher became, I don't want to use the word convert, because I've only read a review of the book. I haven't read the book myself, but I do know it dealt with near-death experiences. And he felt that there was something incredibly spiritual in near-death experiences. And I have a very, very different point of view because I'm not a spiritual person. I don't believe in fact, I'm not even sure what is meant by the word spirit. I know, I sort of have an idea of what it is, but I couldn't define it the way that I could define various everyday concepts like a brick or Jell-O pudding or something like that. And I couldn't define it in the same sense that I could define liberty or equality or the color red or things like this. But I certainly know that it's something that, the idea of spirit permeates most cultures. And it's felt that near-death experience, it has something to do with spirituality. I have a very different point of view. My feeling is based on the way evolution works. Evolution works. What is successful survives, and almost invariably, the concept of a near-death experience occurs when an individual is in an extremely stressful situation. I can't imagine encountering death, being close to death, because we all want to survive. It's built into every single living being, not being a stressful experience. And so one of the things that could conceivably have happened, I don't know whether it has, but I would think that there could be experiments to determine whether or not my explanation of this is a correct one, is that when an individual encounters one of these extremely stressful near-death situations, that's as opposed to the near-death experience with seeing the light and feeling all at peace. There are various different ways for the organism itself to behave. One possibility is for it to go into a very passive, accepting, tranquil mode. In fact, many animals do this. When they're attacked, some animals, when they're attacked, fight back as if their lives depended upon it. Some animals curl up and try to simulate, as if they were dead in order to persuade the attacker that it isn't worth continuing the attack. These are two standard methods of approaching, approaching a situation like this that occurs in the animal kingdom. And it's very possible that if you were to look at humanity in its past, both lines of defense were tried in near-death situations. One was to adopt an extremely aggressive approach towards the situation and try and fight it. Another was for a program to kick in the brain to induce a feeling of calm, tranquility, relaxation. And what happened is evolution favors what works. And near-death experiences seem to be fairly homogeneous across all cultures. The experience of near-death, when you read about them, it doesn't matter whether they happen in America or China or the Samoan Islands. They seem to be pretty much the same. And my conjecture, and it's only a conjecture, is that this is what worked. The fight reaction didn't work as well, and so evolution tended to favor accepting it, powering down the organism in order to survive. That's just my explanation. And I'm willing to venture that if you look at a number of other things that might be on the border, I've forgotten the other possibility that you mentioned besides near-death experiences. Could you recall it to me?
It was spirit. What we call spirit.
I'm not capable of discussing spirits. I looked at dictionary definitions of spirits. In fact, I included a couple of dictionary definitions of spirits, and there were two ways that one looked at it. One was the idea of a spirit as something which transcends the body, and now you're getting into a problem which has puzzled philosophers for millennia, and I'm not the person to be able to resolve this. there's something called the mind-brain problem. What is the mind? What is the brain? The brain is a physical organism. The mind is, well, it's what's going on with the brain does. Very difficult problem. Things like this, you need philosophers and possibly scientists of much greater skill than I am to unravel it, and I'm not willing to take a shot at it.
Well,
or capable of taking a shot at it.
There's two areas within the paranormal that sort of have a direct relationship with mathematics, numerology, and to some degree astrology. What are your thoughts on those two?
They're mixed. First of all, let's deal with the one that I find hardest to accept at first, and that's the idea of numerology. If you take a look at numerology, it ascribes various mystical properties or various properties to the universe, to people, based on some sort of numerical relation. And I looked at, I describe an encounter I had at a party which alerted me to numerology about 20 or 30 years ago, and I looked at some websites on numerology when I was writing the book. And one of the ideas that permeates virtually anything you will read on numerology is something called the life path number. The life path number, first of all, the life path number, there were so many things that are bizarre and difficult to credit about the life path number that I lost interest in numerology really quickly. Here are a few of them. First of all, your life path, numerology is claimed to be the 2,500-year-old science of numbers. Life path numbers are based on, first of all, they're based on the decimal system. The decimal system came into prominence much more recently than 2,500 years ago. So it wasn't even part of, whenever numerology was originally conceived, it was conceived 2,500 years ago, it didn't use the decimal system. It also uses numerology, life path numbers also use our current calendar. I forget whether our calendar is called the Georgian calendar or the Julian calendar, but it's a Roman-based calendar. Why doesn't it use a more ancient calendar like the Hebrew calendar, the Chinese calendar, or the Indian calendar? But lastly, and this is something almost nobody realizes about numerology that just blew it away for me, in, I think it was the year 1572, they started discovering that the year was going out of whack in the following sense. They were discovering that winter and spring and summer and fall were coming at times that were wrong relative to the calendar. It was sort of like, it wasn't quite as bad as having snow in June in Los Angeles, but they were noticing that the calendar was falling out of phase, and they discovered how to make more accurate astronomical measurements, and so they came up with a number of corrections. One of the corrections that they came up with was the idea of leap year. That hadn't existed, but they put it in. But what was even more interesting is that they adjusted the calendar. And the way they adjusted the calendar was that they mandated, I'm not sure whether or not I remember the dates exactly right, but I think so. The day after October 4th, 1572 was not October 5th, 1572. There never was an October 5th, 1572, nor an October 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, or 14th. They jumped immediately from October 4th, 1572 to October 15th, 1572. Now, this plays absolute havoc with life path numbers, and to me, it made numerology have no sense. Astrology is a little different. I have different feelings about astrology. First of all, astrology was originally devised by Ptolemy, who was perhaps the most brilliant scientist of his day. And You were talking about PBS programs. I actually saw one of the best descriptions of astrology and its relevance that I'd ever heard when I was looking at a PBS program on the life of Linus Pauling, who I think was one of the great men of the 20th century. He won one Nobel Prize in chemistry, almost won another because Watson and Crick beat him to the structure of DNA, but it was really close, and he also won a Nobel Prize for Peace. And he was giving a talk at a university, and there was a question and answer session afterwards, and one of the students in the audience asked him what he thought about astrology. And he said, astrology was developed by a truly brilliant scientist, a man named Ptolemy. And he said, I think Ptolemy was such a good scientist that were he alive today, he would look at the universe and all that we know about it, and he would say, based on what I see we have discovered, the rationale that I constructed for astrology was wrong, and I would abandon it as a possible mode of explanation. Now, on the other hand, I have pretty good feelings about astrology because astrology, for the most part, I don't think people really fervently believe in astrology anymore. I think what they do is when you look at an astrology column in the newspaper, most people, the astrology column says for entertainment purposes, and back in the 1970s when I was trying to get a date, you could walk into a party and say, you look like a Libra, and that would start the conversation. So this was, if nothing else, it was an automatic opening line, so that certainly helped for somebody who had difficulty getting dates. And in addition to which, there's a great deal of, if you take a look at astrology, it doesn't really seem that there's, that much really harmful has come of it. I think in the book I said soccer is an extremely popular form of entertainment. Thousands of people have died in soccer riots. Astrology is also a popular form of entertainment, and I haven't heard of a single person who even stubbed their toe in an astrology riot. So as far as I'm concerned, astrology is a very benign form of entertainment for most people, and I don't have a problem with it simply because I don't think people really accept it as a science anymore. It sort of surprises me that more people tend to accept numerology as a legitimate explanation than they do astrology. But that's possibly because people sort of understand science is more a part of people's lives. People understand that the stars are out there and they're a long distance away, and they don't really, these astrology talks about patterns and they don't affect it that much. But people really don't understand mathematics, and so they think there may very well be some mystical power to the number 8 because they're not really comfortable with numbers.
Well, Jim, many paranormal investigators, they use math while conducting their cases without even really realizing it. Now, we use tools that measure our surroundings using a gauge and compute the variances to recognize fluctuation and frequency. And we also use time to measure what we call spirit activity, and again, it's frequency. So how can we bring more of mathematics into the field of paranormal, specifically in search of what we call spirit activity?
Okay, again, this is a little hard for me to answer because it's hard for me to understand exactly what spirits are. But let's look at it as, I don't know what spirits are, but let's look at it as you're just trying to conduct an experiment to establish something. It doesn't matter particularly what. And what you'd like to do is you would like to convince people that you've done a good job. And here's what I would say, and I've been asked this question a couple of times. The question you've just asked me, I've been asked in various guises, because I'm a pretty orthodox scientist for the most part, despite the fact that I wrote this book. I'm pretty much down the middle in what I believe, and I would say most people would accept me as part of the scientific community. And I would say that rather than, I've talked to some people who consider themselves ghost hunters or something like that, and they would say, how do you get people, how can we get the scientific community to accept results about ghosts? And what you have to do in this instance is you have to essentially ask the scientific community what it would take to convince them. Because now I haven't spent much time investigating ghost hunters, although I've certainly seen some entertaining things about this, and I would put spirits on roughly the same level of ghosts. What you have to do is you have to convince people, and just having a bunch of people go into a house and measure stuff isn't really going to convince anybody, because even though you may be using the world's highest tech equipment, you may be using incredibly sensitive frequency measuring devices, what you haven't done is you haven't set up a hypothesis, you haven't set up controlled situations, and this may be very, very difficult to do, just because of the nature of what you're trying to investigate. I'm willing to accept that there may very well be such thing as ghosts. I don't completely rule them out. I don't believe in them, but I don't rule them out. But let's suppose, for instance, you were to ask somebody in the 16th century to prove the existence of radioactivity. They couldn't come close because they didn't have adequate devices to measure it. What may happen is that at the moment, with the best intention in the world and the best frequency measuring devices that we've got, maybe what we haven't got is the right devices to measure what it is that ghosts are. So to a certain extent, you may be, as the poker players say, drawing dead in this particular situation. But if you are not, what I would do is I would find somebody, and I'm not the right person for this. I might be the right person for something like telepathy or remote viewing, because I can think of ways to devise legitimate experiments that would tend to convince the scientific community. And what Dean Radin believes that there are enough partial results that the totality of all these partial results are convincing through a statistical technique called meta-analysis. And that's mathematics, and we don't really want to go into that at the moment, but that's what convinces him. But if you want to convince people, if you want to convince orthodox science of the reality of things that they don't believe in at the moment, what you have to do is you have to say, well, what's it going to take to convince you? Because that's basically the way that orthodox science is done. As I said, there have been a lot of experiments that have proven that theories that people thought were ridiculous were true. There's an acid test of some sort. Now, I'm not sure that there would be an acid test for something like this. There's an acid test for establishing E equals MC squared, for instance. There are acid tests for a lot of different scientific phenomena. And one of the things that makes science doable is that for the most part, it deals with things that are, on the scheme of things, relatively simple. And just to give you an idea of the relative level of complexity of stuff that we're talking about, science does a pretty good job of analyzing stars and galaxies, which have millions of components in them. Stars and galaxies are simple compared with a single living cell. A single living cell is simple compared with the way living cells are put together to create an organ, such as the liver or the heart. Organs are simple compared with the way they are put together to create living beings. Living beings are simple compared to the way that living beings interact with each other. So we've only been doing science seriously for maybe 300 or 350 years, since Newton, I think, is the first real serious science that has been done. The human race has been around, for close to millions of years. The universe has been around for billions of years. There's, science is very young as an enterprise, and we may just be asking too much of science at the moment to establish these things, but I don't know of any experiment that has ever been done that says there are no such things as ghosts. There is no such thing as telepathy. There are no such things as spirits, simply because that's not the way science operates. Science can't tell that there are... Science can't close the lid firmly on anything. All it can do is say that something's highly unlikely, bordering on impossible. It just can't show that something is impossible, because everything that you can imagine that seems impossible actually can happen given enough time, even though it's highly improbable. Rivers can flow uphill, for instance. Things like that can happen. Instead of, the classic example of the way time progresses is that if you put an ice cube in a glass of warm water, the ice cube melts. Even though you've never seen this, I will never see it, it's possible that you could stare at a glass of warm water and without outside refrigeration, an ice cube could spontaneously form in it. It's not, it's so unlikely as to be borderline impossible, but it could happen. And so science can't say things can't happen. They can only say that things are really, really, really unlikely. And science just may not yet have the tools at the moment to cope with the paranormal. And to some extent, that's one of the reasons that I wrote the book, is because I think these things really, I think science does itself a big disservice by saying we don't want to look at stuff. And I'm glad that there's Brian Josephson, an outlier, investigating paranormal phenomena. I'm glad that Dean Radin thought enough of looking at whether or not human consciousness can affect the universe to abandon his orthodox scientific career and try looking at a problem that was really difficult but could make a really fantastic change in the way we view the universe. I think that's extremely important work. I think that trying to discover whether or not human consciousness really can affect the physical universe, it would absolutely revolutionize the way we think of what we could do, what human potential is. You got to keep this on the table. Even if it's a long shot, you got to keep it on the table.
In your book, The Paranormal Equation, you mentioned that there's a lot of fraud, and you mentioned it actually earlier in the interview. A lot of fraud when it comes to both science and in the paranormal. And, we are familiar with the paranormal side of it and the fraud that goes on, but we were surprised to read about the scientific fraud. Are you able to elaborate a little bit more on that?
Oh yeah, I mean it happens. I won't say it happens all the time, but it happens with some frequency, and for basically the same reason that fraud happens in other areas, and that's personal gain. Probably the most well-known example of fraud was a British psychologist named Cyril Burt, who later became known as Sir Cyril Burt because his work in psychology was so groundbreaking and so important that he was eventually knighted by the British government. And what happened was, it was later discovered, what he did was he investigated, he did a lot of studies on twins. And it was investigated, it was discovered that he falsified data in order to substantiate his conclusions. This happens time and again. And I read a magazine called Science, which is a little too technical for the general public because it's mostly the articles in it are generally technical, and even the survey articles generally require some degree of a technical background. But I would say that at least once a year, and maybe more frequently than that, there's a notable case of fraud in the scientific community where an individual has to retract things and is generally kicked off the island. Because it's amazing. When I look at, do the names Elliot Spitzer and Anthony Weiner mean anything to you?
Oh, yes, I'm from New York.
Oh, okay. Well, they're back on the island. Elliot Spitzer is a commentator for Fox. Anthony Weiner is running for mayor of New York. And these are basically reprehensible individuals. You do something like that in science, and you are never, ever coming back. Forget about it. Science is, and that's one of the way. I don't know about you, but do you have a whole lot of credibility in politicians?
Not so much.
Yeah. Do you have a whole lot of credibility in science?
You know what? To be honest, I don't think I could give you an honest answer on that.
Well, let me put it this way: you go into your doctor's office. He says this is gonna prevent you from getting polio. Do you take the injection?
Of course.
Okay. And on a day-in, day-out basis, we trust science. That's not to say that, science makes mistakes and science gets overturned. But science is, as I said, it's not the last word, it's the latest word. And if you take a look, for instance, at just diet, when I grew up, you were supposed to eat lots of red meat, very healthy stuff. Now we know that, for the most part, if you eat lots of red meat, your cholesterol count's going to go way up and you're going to get a heart attack. That isn't because science was doing anything fraudulent. It was just giving you, they felt they needed protein. This was an efficient way to get protein. Makes perfect sense. But science in general, you asked me if I knew examples of fraud in science. There are examples, but they're few and far between. I can't think of a single human activity that is less tainted by fraud than science. For instance, religion, don't even go there. Politics, not even close. If you look at the people associated with our legal system, with the military, with arts and entertainment, whole lot of fraud practically everywhere.
Right.
It's just that science proceeds by getting it right. And not only does it get it right, what it does is there's science. The way that it confirms what it is that it does is by saying, this is what we think, take your best shot. And I don't know anything else that does that. When a scientific theory is proposed, it's not proposed because it's not accepted because somebody brilliant proposed it. It's proposed because they got supporting evidence, and the moment that somebody shows unequivocally that wrong thinking has taken place, the paradigm is overturned and we shift. And that's the history of science. There are a lot of failed theories out there, theories that are proven wrong, not because they were proposed for fraudulent reasons, but because our understanding of things was inadequate. But we eventually get it right. And if you want tribute to this, well, we're flying in airplanes, we're talking on we're talking on cell phones, we're doing magnetic resonance image studies, and that's because we've got it right. To a certain extent, we understand the universe. We're a pretty impressive species. We've done all this in 300 years.
Absolutely.
Well, you know what, Jim? I have one last question.
Sure.
If there is one thing your readers remember from your book, The Paranormal Equation, what would you hope stays in their mind forever? That science and scientists are fallible, but they make an effort to get it right. Excellent. Excellent. Well, you know what? It has been a mind-blowing hour with you, Jim. We would like to thank you for coming on the show, and we wish you the best in everything. Is there somewhere where people can learn more about your work or to contact you for more information?
Yeah, I hate to say this, but I'm probably the only living individual who doesn't have a Facebook page, doesn't tweet, etc. Or at least but anyway, I teach mathematics at California State University, Long Beach. If one Googles the website and goes to the mathematics department, I have an email address, and whenever anybody asks me a question, I do my best to answer it. And like scientists, I answer questions honestly. I don't BS. If somebody asks me a question that is too deep for me, I'll say, and you actually asked me a couple of questions that were beyond the scope of my ability to even take a shot at tonight. I'll tell them that, But if I know something, I'll say it. If I have an opinion, I'll say it, but I'll say that it's an opinion. And what I'll also do is if somebody asks me a question that I don't know, but I might be able to find out, I'll say, let me get back to you, and I will get back to them, and I'll say, here's what I found out, and here's the authority that's behind it.
Wonderful.
Jim.Stein at csulb.edu.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you again.
It's been
Jim.
a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me again on your show.
Well, for our listeners, please pick up The Paranormal Equation, a new scientific perspective on remote viewing, clairvoyance, and other inexplicable phenomena on Amazon.com. Have a wonderful weekend, Jim, and we hope that you'll come back on the show again soon.
Well, you have my phone number, you have my email address, and I respond positively to any opportunity such as this and any invitation. I've really enjoyed being on your show. Thank you very much.
We've enjoyed having you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Sure.
Have a great
Good night.
weekend.
You
Good
too.
night.
Bye-bye.
You know, I was never a great math student in school. I don't know about you, Lucy.
No.
But when I was actually in, I think it was Barnes and Nobles, and I was looking at the the alternative section. It's usually where I gravitate to whenever I'm in a bookstore, and I came across The Paranormal Equation, his book. And it really intrigued me enough to purchase it because, when you mix the science world and paranormal, it's very few and far between that you ever find anything that is somewhat positively or influenced in literature when you combine those two aspects of the world. And when I noticed the title and I read the back cover of it, it sort of intrigued me enough to purchase the book, and I did, and I went home and I started to read a little bit about it and skim through it a little bit just to see, some bits of the chapters, and it really got me. It's not a 100% factoid piece of work that says, okay, mathematics can explain the paranormal, and I kind of agree with Jim to the point where, paranormal may be beyond the realm of being measured, being measured by anything. It's probably just the nature of what the paranormal world is, that it probably may never be suitable for experiments or to even be adopted and accepted within the scientific community. It may just be beyond that realm. But the idea that Jim puts forward in his book is being able to keep the open mind and being playful enough to use mathematics or try and use mathematics enough to the point that you can possibly, maybe draw some or pave some roads in the ground that link the two together and may lead to answers or other answers that could explain the paranormal. I mean, Lucy, you and I have talked about this in so many other shows and even off shows that we've talked personally about the and again, here I go again, Lucy, the web that is connected between the two. And if mathematics and science can do that, it's all the more better. I don't think in my lifetime, and I don't think in, my children's lifetime or grandchildren's lifetime, that this will ever happen. I don't think that we will get to the point where science has come to the knowledge and the fruition that they have found something substantial enough to back up paranormal claims. I think it is. I think paranormal is beyond science. I don't think that it will ever be captured enough that it could be written down on paper. And simply because I think because paranormal is paranormal. It is something that is out of this world, to be corny enough to say. And that's more of the intrigue that has, sort of ignited that fire and that flame in myself. And I think I can speak for you, Lucy, as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. One thing I found interesting, and I will admit, reading the book for me was difficult. Math has not exactly been my strongest subject. But I am very, very partial to geometry, to trigonometry, to the logic base. And when he was mentioning Pythagoras' theory about the right angles, that, to me, I totally understand that. And I totally understand the logics. And I know that science is based off of known theories. You have to have a proven. You have to have a given point to start with. So that right there is going to stop science from even addressing some of the things in the paranormal, because we don't have those givens. We don't have that bottom line theory to work off. You have to have a theory first. And from that theory, you have to have these proofs. You know, A is equal to 90 degrees, and then, you know, going on from that. But the one hope that I did get from all of this is the things that fall into the category of unprovable, the things within mathematics itself that they kind of fall into a category that they don't have a proof. And that's where I'm thinking the paranormal is. It is something that is unknown. This is the big unknown. When you want to find the value of n, this is what it is. The paranormal is n. So certain things he addresses, like such as telepathy. You can, of course, there is kind of like a way that you can prove it, because you can go in with the MRI and you can look at the physical changes within the brain. Okay, when he brought up the point about how we know what the brain is, but we don't exactly know what the mind is. Okay, it's a given. Well, the same thing with, he said that I know what 3 oranges are, but I don't know what the number 3 is. The paranormal, to me, is the same thing. I think we can get close to explaining certain things, but as he said, he's not going to address spirits, because we don't, as a whole, as a community, we really don't have a definitive answer as to what a spirit is. So in order to prove something, we almost have to prove exactly what a spirit is. And within the paranormal community, there are so many theories as to what it is, until we can come up with something that says definitively, a spirit is such and such. It has such and such properties. A ghost is such and such, and it has such and such properties. Until we can get to that point, I don't believe that science is truly going to be able to accept. Now, the other sad part about it was the point that he brought up, that, scientific studies are in essence based on money. How can, things get studied when it's going to benefit somebody else? So there's so many things in the world that may never, ever be looked at because there's not a grant to fund it, because the government doesn't feel that it's going to be profitable. That, to me, is probably the saddest part of the whole paranormal equation.
Well, I agree with you, and I agree with what Jim had mentioned, and to just tag along to what you were just talking about, scientists won't touch the paranormal until after they've been established. They have to establish their credibility, their ranking within the science community before they even think about, putting paranormal down on paper, because if they start with that, they will be, either laughed out of the science community, or they won't be backed by financially by the government or private sectors. So the idea that it's a paranormal to a science, even though it may be a passion of theirs, and maybe there's 50% of the scientists out there that really do have some sort of belief or knowledge or even experience in the paranormal, they will not touch it, creating experiments or conducting experiments in that factor to try and prove it until they have made themselves within the community, created that rank for themselves, that credibility to sort of legitimize their work in order for people to turn around and look at them and listen to what they have to say. I don't blame the scientists for doing that. I completely understand why they need to do it. As Jim was mentioning, science is a results-oriented community, and so naturally you have to have results for your hypothesis, for your cases, in order for people to understand and to, I guess, increase the knowledge to the world as their, I guess, part of their roster, as part of their lengthy list of things accomplished. They have to create these results, and they have to be proven reality. But to me personally, and I don't know how many people agree with me on this, that we've said this before, that paranormal, I don't think the idea of the answer as to what paranormal is, whether it be spirits, clairvoyance, ESP, remote viewing, astral projecting, spirit activity, any of that stuff, I don't believe will ever be quote-unquote legitimized. I even hate to use that word, or proven. Maybe that's a better adjective to use. I don't think paranormal will ever be proven as reality, simply because I believe that the idea and the thought and the knowledge of anything and everything that is paranormal is not meant for us to understand within this world, within our living human bodies. I don't think it is meant to be understood. I don't think it's meant to be explained to anyone who is not embodied within the paranormal, if you understand what I mean by that. That you have to cross over in order to sort of understand what it's all about, what life is all about. And to me, because of that idea that I have, I don't believe that science is able to record any of it, because the answers, to me, are unrecordable. But the reason why, Lucy, you and I go out and investigate locations and try and further the communication between spirits is more so to get an understanding, as much of an understanding as we can while living in this three-dimensional world, of what that other side is all about, or what links there are to some of the other paranormal subcategories of UFOs and Bigfoot, and if there are links to it. And that I think is what I'm more after, and I think you are as well, Lucy. And in sort of like, having the carrot at the end of the stick when you're trying to lead a horse around. It's there. The answer is there. As much as you try and reach for it and grab for it, you never will. But the experience and the journey that you go through in order to try and reach for that carrot, I think is enticing enough and is increasing the knowledge of every living being on this planet, and also giving everybody an awareness, an awakening to a lot of things that people necessarily don't like to talk about or sort of create as being taboo. That's my thought, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to bring Jim on the show, was to, I guess, play the buttons a little bit and see, how does someone with Jim's credentials as being a mathematician and being of California State, how does he interpret the paranormal world, or how does he incorporate math into it? And it was pretty interesting. And that's one of the reasons why I think Lucy and I wanted to have him on the show, was to share, again, that knowledge, and also question things, have people question a lot of it. And maybe, whatever we discussed on the show tonight, that will sort of further enhance your research, or further enhance, the flame and the fire that is underneath you, to continue to do what you do, to continue to do the research and in the investigations, or if you call yourself a ghost hunter, the hunting that you do. It's just a matter of further embracing and further encouraging all of the fellow people within the paranormal world.
Well, what I'm hoping, I know for me, this experience talking to Jim, reading his book, gave me a perspective like you said, from a scientist, quote, a scientist side. But it also reinforces the fact of what I know and what I believe to be my truths, that I do believe that there is a paranormal. I think every paranormal investigator believes that, otherwise they wouldn't be doing what they do. And it also just kind of points at the fact that the answers are not going to come from the scientific side. The answers are going to come from within our side. And we've talked about it before. You know, we're the paranormal pioneers. We're the ones that are going out there, you know, doing the investigations, doing the research. Sure, we can measure fluctuations in conditions when we are in a location, when there is activity. But I think the answers that we're seeking, again, maybe we won't find them within our lifetime, but I think we're the ones that we truly believe, and we're the ones that are actually going out there and searching. And if there is an answer to come forth, it's going to come from our side. You know, one thing that I thought of, I remember a while back, there was some talk about, you know, creating some kind of paranormal board or something that this was back when all kinds of drama was going on. And there was some talk on the web about, you know, maybe creating some kind of governing board, which I thought was completely a wrong direction to go, because I don't think that there is anyone uniquely qualified to make that determination. I think this whole idea of the paranormal as we know it is so vast and so different that we're not going to get a definitive answer to compare about. We can take our evidence, we can take everything that we gather ourselves, and we can present it to others. And I've said this before, what we present is not the end-all, tell-all for myself, but it is an experience that maybe someone else can take, compare it to their own experience, and as we go along, then we can develop some kind of thought as to what these specifically are. I mean, to this day, people still argue about what an orb is. I mean, we truly don't know what shadow people are. You know, EVPs, we kind of like have a little bit more to go on. I mean, you know, people, I totally thought of Brian Kalick when I was thinking about this, you know, what an EVP is and how sound travels from one dimension to another. But then that goes back to the fact that there is some proof of different dimensions, but there's no real, I mean, like he said, we don't know what he doesn't know what the number 3 is. Well, in my world, I don't really truly know what a different dimension is. I know that there is something beyond what I can see, touch, and feel. I know this, but I don't have that definitive proof. I guess bottom line, what I'm trying to get at is that this is so vast and it's so huge, and maybe we're not supposed to find out what it is until we're ready. But I think each individual person has to develop their own sense of what they're looking for. We know what we're looking for, but do we really? I mean, that's kind of like, wow, this is just like so huge.
No, and I don't think we do know what we're looking for. I mean, here's the basic fact. We as human beings, you know, regardless scientist, paranormal investigator, or just a regular, you know, layman out on the street, we've only, I guess, sort of chipped the piece of the iceberg, really. We only know about 5% of this universe. The other 95% is unknown to us as human beings. What lurks within that 95% is up for grabs. It's up for theory. There is vast amounts of ideas and formulations that people can create as to what exists within that 95%. Does paranormal exist in that 95%? Sure, maybe it could. It has not been studied, and it has not been found to be, you know, real. I mean, and I don't want to get on scientists, as many people have. To be fair, scientists really don't know if, and I think Jim mentioned this earlier, if the universe is infinite or not. And I don't think, for them, they will never know that. And the universe is something that science studies. So there are facets within the scientific community when they will unable to be able to. Did I just make sense there? I don't think I did. They will be unable to measure or to find out whether or not the universe is infinite. I mean, think about it. If you were to set out on a spaceship right now and, shoot yourself up into space and just continually fly into the universe and go in one direction, when will it end? Will you reach an end? And how do you get that knowledge? How do you understand whether or not that it exists, if there is a end point to the universe? What does that end look like? And so I don't think scientists will ever have that answer. I don't think it will ever come to them. So for anyone who says to you, it's not a good thing that you'll never find the answer to the paranormal, what people consider to be a real answer to the paranormal. Well, you know what? You can always turn around and say, well, science doesn't have real answers to a lot of what they study. They will never find the real answers to it. It's impossible for them to do that. And so I don't feel bad when people don't believe or understand the paranormal world, because there are a lot of things that the science community, excuse me, that still do not understand and probably will never understand. One of the things that Jim had mentioned, which actually really surprised me and was a fact that I never knew about, was when he was talking about the Georgian calendar and in regards to numerology. And the fact that he mentioned, and I have to look this up because I want to find out if it is true. It's not that I don't believe Jim, but I want to find out for myself. That's what I like to do. I need to look at it myself and research it in order for me to believe it. But the idea that from October 5th, 1572 to October 15th, 1572 does not exist. Those days do not exist because they adjusted the calendar to sort of realign the way that the seasons were matching up with the numbers on the calendar. And so, for almost 9-10 days are non-existent in history in 1572. And so he did make a good point that because of that shift, because of that adjustment, all the numbers now that correlate within numerology have sort of been out of whack. And I think that may be an interesting twist to numerology to actually try and study more, if in fact that it is true that it created that shift within numerology, and any numerologist out there is not a fraud, but is possibly misknowledged, if that's a word, or don't have the correct numbers or answers to what they're giving out because of this adjustment. So, we're finding that there are so many things that, people think are true within the paranormal community, and then you find information like this, like Jim had mentioned, that sort of make you think, okay, maybe we need to readjust it. And I think that is something that the paranormal community really needs to do, is it's not a bad thing to question how people conduct their investigations or experiments. I think it is horrible in the way that we go about doing that. I don't believe in the bashing. Lucy and I do not believe in any of that. But it is good to question other people and to bring the debate and the communication and that dialogue out to further enhance what we're all out there doing. And so if this, numerology may be upset by this shift of numbers back in 1572, the shift of dates back in 1572, then we need to reevaluate it so that we make sure that we correct it if it is an issue, and so that we have a solid foundation to move forward on. Because if we don't, then everything else is sort of misaligning and is misguiding everybody, and that's not fair to us within the paranormal community. So I question everything. I always do that. It is not the skeptic in me, but it's always the person who always tries to find as close to the truth as possible, and that's what I'm all about. That's how I conduct my life and how I conduct my paranormal investigating. I always try and see if whether there is a logical answer for things, but when there isn't, I never try and disprove it, or I never try and prove it. It's always left to be sort of out there. I tend to, put it on one of those, Jetsons UFOs and fly it off into space and just let it be. I don't try and make it a case for anything, because you will never be able to prove paranormal to a non-believer. It will never happen. And so you're just wasting your energy and time. And so I think for what Lucy and I do, we're able to capture, answers or knowledge or any kind of information that we do within the paranormal, and we just throw it out there into the universe so that if it's able to be worked on even further, or it's able to answer some things, or it's able to make a believer out of someone, then great. But we try and help the community that way. And if it means trying to realign and readjust what has been the history of paranormal to make it true, then we should all be doing that so that we have a better foundation to work forward and continue to go forward on, so that anything new that we accomplish is more quote-unquote legitimate, and we have a better footing to stand on.
Well, you know what, on the numerology thing, what he said makes sense. And I had known about the adjustment in the calendar before, but it never really, I never really thought about it. And yes, it is logical, okay? It is logical that if the calendar had been changed and there was an adjustment made, then how can these readings or these life path numbers be correct? But then on the other side, when you actually do look at these, personally, for myself, when I look at numerology, there are certain things that come up in the calculations and the results of the calculations that actually do make sense, that you can find something that really does apply to you. Now, whether it's something that I'm just looking to see, oh yeah, that's right, oh yeah, that makes sense. It's just kind of interesting that I can look at a numerology reading and I can get something from it that makes sense to me. Now, all in all, the conversation and reading the book just kind of highlighted something for me. And I'm going to throw it out there. I believe that science, the scientific side, is very limited to what they are going to accept and understand. I think that because of the fact that they need this logic and they need this definite proof, that I don't think that they're going to allow themselves to actually get answers as to paranormal. In other words, I don't think the paranormal is ever really going to fit in with what we consider science. I think paranormal is a science in itself. It's a completely separate thing, because no matter how much you can throw out so many theories and you can throw out so many actual proof that science has, it's not going to change what I know to be real for myself. And again, it goes back to what I've said before. Everyone has their own personal truth. For me, my personal truth is there is such a thing as the paranormal. I don't have logical proof. I only have what I've experienced and what I can gather to present to someone else. But bottom line is, I know what I know. Now, my experiences can be the same as someone else. You and I have experienced some of the same things when we go into locations. So from a scientific point of view, how does that happen? How can we, too, have the same experiences that another group may be having? Or, when you look at it, then all of a sudden you've got all these small little factions that are having the same kind of experience. But because we don't have anything, we don't have a set theory that says, okay, this means this and this, it doesn't make it not real.
Well, it's exactly what Jim had said, and the idea of having to explain the number 3 to someone. How do you explain number 3? But besides saying that there are 3 cars or there are 3 sticks or 3 apples, but how do you explain what the number 3 is? And I think anybody can say that to what paranormal is. You can't explain it. I mean, you can put it in so many words. You can, sort of describe it, give your experiences of it, explain it in a way that is knowledgeable to you, because paranormal, like you said, is the experience of the experiencer. It is of within you, and therefore that is the answer to paranormal, because paranormal means so many different things to so many different people. And so it's along those same lines. So science and mathematicians, they can't explain what 3 is. So we shouldn't really expect them to explain what paranormal is or anything within the paranormal. And so I think we need to start shifting away from the idea that science and scientific community would help paranormal if they were to get on board and experiment and conduct more cases or work in conjunction with paranormal investigators. I think we need to maybe move away from that or not stress so much on that idea and, turn to the paranormal community and all of the groups, the great groups that are paranormal groups and ghost hunting groups that are out there right now that are really in the community, in the paranormal community, to try and find answers. I think those are the people that should be aligning themselves together. Those are the people that we should be backing. Because as he said before, as Jim had mentioned before, scientists are not going to do this, right off the bat. If they are going to do it, they're going to first worry about making sure that they win a Nobel Peace Prize or some science award so that they create this ranking for themselves, and then they will possibly, if they are interested in the paranormal, will start to conduct some experiments on it. But at that point, they're pretty much, in their later years of living on this planet and may not, spend as much time or concentrate as much as they would if they were in their 20s, or 30s in their younger years, so that they have the energy to be doing and conducting all of these experiments. So I don't think we should wait for science. I think we should put an end to the idea that science is helpful if they were to get on board. Yes, they would be. But I think you're trying to move a boulder with one person. It's not going to happen. It will never happen. So, conduct these things within the paranormal community and back each and every one that is legitimized, that there are groups, the groups that are out there that are really in it for the right reasons, back those people up and become a bigger community that way.
Well, one thing that I just thought about, and I want to get your take on it. You know how he was saying that okay, scientists, they're not going to study anything unless there's backing for it. Okay, when it comes to UFOs, it looks like, it appears that the scientific community is willing to study UFOs and possibly alien life. So maybe, do you think that will work backwards? Because we've already touched on, the synchronicity, that thread, that web that connects everything. And I have, in my own experience now, seen kind of like that line go from the paranormal, from spirit activity and ghosts, to UFOs. So since science is willing to address the fact of UFOs, aliens, and possibly beings from another planet, do you think maybe it'll work its way back? Do you think that'll ever happen?
Well, we don't have time tonight to discuss that fact, because you know my ideas and my theories on UFOs. I mean, personally, I think, and I'll say this with a big P, people really know whether or not that alien life exists. They already know that already. I think the answer has already been proven, and things have been hidden from the public, I think, for many, many years right now. And the idea that is being proposed as the search for alien life, either in the universe or on other planets, or recently now on Mars, is sort of convoluted in a way, and is, to me, it could be a topic for another show, but is meant to sort of try and see how much longer they can extend this whole question mark over alien intelligent life form elsewhere, and to sort of keep our interest piqued, and the idea that the government and agencies all around the world already have come in contact with alien life, that we can they can string us, quote unquote us, all along to keep the mass hysteria down. I don't know. It is. I've got so many issues with that idea of whether or not it can work backwards from UFOs and alien life. I think it's already happening. I think it may sound sort of like a made-for-TV movie or something that you see on a film, but we talked about this earlier in another show about UFOs, that there is that reverse engineering that has been going on for a long time, and so the idea that they have been using alien spaceships and sort of the reverse engineering, taking it apart, using all of that, and that's what we see as far as laptops and lasers and all of that spike in technology that has happened within the last 40, 50 years, is due to the I guess, trying to think of the word, the finding of UFOs and alien life forms. And so, the knowledge that other things within the paranormal, spirits and ESP and clairvoyance, remote viewing, all of that, I think, has already been answered. I honestly do think that it's already been answered. There are people on this planet that know the real, true answers to all of it, and it's being hidden from all of us. And I don't want to get on these conspiracy theories, but I think it's already been known, and it's up to us to try and find those answers if we do know it.
Well, I believe, no matter what science has, I believe in the paranormal. I mean, I wouldn't be doing what we do if I didn't. And I think there's so many people out there that do. And I don't think it's going to stop any one of us from continuing our search and our journey to find some kind of answers. And if I have to do it without science, then so be it. I mean, I honestly think that, sure, we've got things in our lives that make it easier through scientific research, but I think everything starts at a point. I mean, at one point, we believed that the earth was flat and we would fall off the edge. Well, I take the paranormal as the same thing. I mean, it's an idea, it's out there, but it's not going to be the scientists that are the ones that are going to make the proof. It's going to be us. We're the ones that go out there, the ones that truly believe, and the ones that are searching. It's going to take the paranormal investigators to bring some kind of answers, and it won't be a definitive answer. I agree with you. It's not going to happen in our lifetime, and it's probably not going to happen for a long time, if any. But I still believe that we're the ones that are going to make a difference.
And I don't think it's going to be the science world either. It is, I just had a thought and I just forgot it. But the idea that science can help the paranormal community, I think is sort of out the window. I think it's done. I think it is, baked and burnt, and has been sort of overly analyzed and overly put on a pedestal, that I think it's time that we sort of searched inward. I think we should search within the community of the paranormal to help boost it. And just to go on what you were just saying before, in history, lightning was considered, the gods being mad at people. And that was the effect that they had on the gods were throwing these bolts of electricity onto the people. And now we know that it's not. It's lightning. It is something within of nature. So with that said, I think the people within the paranormal community need to start looking at the things that we're finding and try and figure out and discern whether or not it is really a paranormal fact or is something that is not. And I think once we do that, or try and educate the people within the paranormal community to know the differences between something that is, possibly something of a maybe sort of a reality truth than a paranormal truth. And so you can figure that out. It's a very fuzzy line, trying to discern what that difference is. But I think if we try and figure out how do you define that, I think that's going to help the community, the paranormal community, a lot better to discern, whether or not something is worth looking into further if it is something within paranormal. And that's the only way to strengthen the community.
Right. No, I agree totally. But I also feel, too, that I think there's a lot of people that really, truly want to believe. And just to go a little further on what you're saying, I mean, so we as paranormal investigators have to really be sure of what we are classifying as a true experience, and that leads into other things, taking into account all of the things that could be leading to this event happening, taking in all of the other variables before we truly consider something to be paranormal, because if we present something, we're going to be held to the fire by the rest of the community, and I think you really have to be sure of what you're putting forth.
And I think a perfect example, but the perfect example that I'm trying to say, and Lucy, you and I mentioned this to you, I think it was last week, that to me, I feel as though the UFO community has sort of got their act together a lot more than the paranormal investigator who's searching out spirits and ghost communication. I think the UFO community has sort of have a better organized group than any other group, I think. That they've created MUFON. They've created MUFON all around the world, and they really do conduct their cases almost as if that they're scientists. And I don't want to demean anyone by saying that. And if there are scientists involved with MUFON, that is absolutely great. Maybe that's sort of something that we should be looking towards as an example of how everyone or every community in the paranormal should conduct themselves. I really do love the way that the UFO community has conducted themselves, and they've really put on what I consider to be these discussions, these panels, these seminars, all of the communication that they do to try and give facts and to conduct their experiments and their searches, and the way that they conduct their cases is absolutely phenomenal. And I'm not saying that paranormal investigating is not like that, but I think they, not to sort of give a hierarchy on things, but I think the UFO community is sort of maybe on a little bit of a higher level than any other paranormal group or community that's out there within anything that's paranormal. And I think that's something that we should really look into trying to create for the paranormal investigators like us within spirit activity. I think that is something that we should look into. And that's what I'm sort of getting at as far as creating that legitimized, group that really is looked up to. And to me, right now, that's the UFO community.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're at a loss because what do we have? We have paranormal TV shows that people have a tendency to take as, that's the truth and that's for real. And when I said before, when it was mentioned before about like making some kind of governing board, my disagreement was that not because I didn't think that it would be beneficial. I just think that there's so many different, we're scattered. We're all, there's so many different viewpoints about what paranormal is. Yeah, we definitely have to get our act together in the paranormal community. We definitely have to come together a little bit more cohesively in order to have something that can be looked at as something or someone to be a reference. And I think that's where it is. I think we truly, as a community, really have to come together and really start addressing what we're looking for, what we're finding, and where we think this can go. Because once we put everything together, then certain truths will come through. But until then, it's going to be, this faction believes this and this section believes that. And you're right, the UFO community does seem to have a little bit more of they have more of a basis that they all agree on. And I think the disagreements within the paranormal community are still way across the board.
Right, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but if we step away from requesting the scientific community to help legitimize or give more, backing to the paranormal community, so we step away from that idea, but incorporate what the scientific community does, I think it will only benefit the paranormal community in the long run. It will help us, one, educate us, but two, be able to get the results or try to come to a conclusion that is understandable to not only, everyday normal people, but to people within the scientific community. And it may catch the eye of a lot more people who can then support what you're doing and support what the paranormal community has been fighting for. And so that is the ultimate reason why Jim Stein's book, The Paranormal Equation, interested me, and the idea that if we bring forth the conception of mathematics, maybe that can help out as well, the academic side of things, and as well as if we reach out to the scientific community and we educate ourselves as to how they conduct their experiments and utilize that within the paranormal community, we may be able to get some answers. Now, I'm not saying that how science conducts their experiments is going to work for the paranormal because, like I said before, I don't think you can put paranormal down on paper. But the way that they conduct it or the way that they treat their cases and their experiments may help us in a way to sort of keep things in line and understandable and maybe open up some other areas that we have never known maybe even possibly existed. So I think maybe we should leave on that note. And if there was anything sort of last that you wanted to say on that topic, Lucy, go ahead.
No, I just want everybody out there, paranormal investigators, to continue to do what you're doing, to continue to search for those answers and to present them. I think what we need to do is we need to keep presenting our evidence. We need to keep submitting to each other what we found, and don't stop searching. I mean, there's so many, and again, he briefly touched on it with the frauds. Yeah, there's fraud in the paranormal community. I mean, nothing breaks my heart more than seeing people posting pictures with these stupid phone apps where they insert a ghost into something. Stuff like that is definitely not going to help us, and reposting something like that somewhere, whether it be on a blog, whether it be on Facebook, whether it be anywhere, is not going to help our cause. But I think to the legitimate investigators, keep posting, keep searching, keep presenting your evidence. And I think that is probably the strongest thing that we have. I mean, don't stop. Don't give up. There's an answer. There's kind of an answer out there, and I think that we're going to be the ones that are going to find it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, so Lucy, why don't we get on with the normal routine that we do?
Okay, which is the Paranormal Review Radio Fan of the Week. And this week, our Paranormal Review Radio Fan of the Week is from California, where you're at, Michelle Wiseman French of Milpitas, California. She is actually one of the super fans of Paranormal Review Radio, which is a group on Facebook. And if you want to join, just search up super fans of Paranormal Review Radio and join. Now, some of Michelle's likes are Metallica. She likes Green Day, Norse mythology, haunted places, powwows, UFOs, vampires, and of course, she likes Paranormal Review Radio. Thank you so much, Michelle, for being a fan. Thank you, and congratulations.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. I've seen her so many times on Facebook commenting. She's so great. So don't forget, if you want to be a Paranormal Review Radio fan of the week, just like us on Facebook, Paranormal Review Radio.
Well, so have we come closer to having the scientific proof that the paranormal does exist, or are we coming closer to finding a way to document what many of us believe is true, that there is such a thing as paranormal phenomena? Well, this was an eye-opening conversation, and we do want to thank Dr. James Stein for joining us tonight. Well, next week is the 4th of July, and it's a time to relax and reflect on this great country of ours and all of the things that we know to be true in the history of the USA, right? It's also a time for picnics and fireworks. And you know what? Next week, we think we may be setting off a few of those fireworks right here live on the air. Now, conspiracies seem to be lurking around every corner, and the moon landing has had its fair share of alternative theories. But have you heard about this one? The great filmmaker Stanley Kubrick may have actually been the one man who faked the moon landing and led us all to believe this great American feat. So what does the movie The Shining have to do with the moon landing? Well, our guest next week, Jay Wiedner, is a filmmaker with credits to the films Kubrick's Odyssey and Kubrick and Apollo. And they both present compelling evidence that show how Stanley Kubrick directed and filmed the lunar landing. Jay will be joining us next Friday night to talk about Stanley Kubrick, the moon landings, and how what we think to be the truth is not exactly the way it is. So seriously, get ready for the fireworks. One small step for man, one giant conspiracy for mankind. We want to thank everyone for listening and being fans of the show. You know, you guys have no idea how much we appreciate every single one of you. Thank you, Anthony, for still another great show. So, until next week, Parapeeps, from both of us, have a paranormal week and a safe and happy 4th of July. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Paranormal Review Radio. Paranormal Review Radio.